Good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. And usually when you have a gathering, a group of people that come together for a meeting or a conference like this, people attend for one of three reasons. You attend because you have to. Hopefully that's not the case. You attend because you want to, or you attend because someone else wants you to be here. And what makes me very excited about this morning is that none of you really have to be here. None of you are here because someone else wanted you to be here. You're here because you heard about the collaboration, you heard about the objectives, and you want to make a contribution. And for me, that sets the stage for a very exciting morning. So we're really looking forward to a great discussion. In the spirit of getting to know you, I'd like to ask a couple of questions. And if you could kindly respond by a show of hands, I would appreciate it. So how many of you have started your own company or intimately been involved in a startup? Wow. So the majority of people here, probably 70% of the people have raised their hands. How many of you have not started your own company, but find it very compelling, very interesting, and it's something that you'd like to do at another point in your career? So there are some aspiring entrepreneurs, people who are interested in entering this wonderful space. And how many of you have not started your own company, not been involved in a startup, and have no interest whatsoever in starting a company? There's got to be somebody, right? Right, there has to be somebody. Well, it's not our objective to change your view on that today, but hopefully over the next hour, we can have a great dialogue about what it takes to start your own company. So with that introduction, ladies and gentlemen, meet our panelists, please. I know that sounded a little like Meet My Millionaires, but I didn't mean to do that. So our third panelist is on his way. He had an issue with his commute from Princeton. He'll be joining us shortly. But right now it's my pleasure to introduce my good friend and colleague, Mr. Walter Greenblatt of Greenblatt and Associates. Walter is based in Princeton, New Jersey. And sitting next to Walter is Dr. James Foley, the managing director of Aqua Partners. And James is based in Ardmore, Pennsylvania. Dr. Hejaji will be joining us shortly. So as we wait for him, I would like to provide a couple points of guidance before we begin. So number one, we've decided to focus on real lessons, real stories, things that people can remember. Because the one thing I know, having sat in a lot of audiences, is that you won't remember the 8th bullet point on a PowerPoint slide 12, but you'll remember an anecdote or a story or a lesson learned or an experience. And that's what our goal is today, to make this very informal. We've also decided to keep a couple of things out of scope. So we're not going to be delving into legal matters, regulatory or compliance matters. Those are too specific and could get us off of our real goal today. And our pleasure, Dr. Hejaji, welcome, welcome.
A man who knows how to use time well.
Someone should get him a coffee or something. Hopefully you're fine. Great. So we won't be going into legal, regulatory, or compliance matters. The other item we will briefly touch on, but it won't be a focus, and that has to do with crowdsourcing and crowdfunding. We know there's a lot of interest there, but it's evolving. And while we'll touch on that, that won't be a central focus to the discussion. So we're going to begin. We're going to spend about 30 minutes in a conversation. Our panelists will have an opportunity to close up with some comments, and then we'll open it up for questions. Does that sound like a reasonable plan? Thank you. Sorry. So what I've done, I've taken the liberty of breaking this conversation into a few pieces, and they're as follows. The first one is the decision. We're going to go from the decision to the first steps. From the first steps, we're going to go to the money. From the money, we're going to go to the pitch and close with the deal. So there's some interesting things to discuss, don't you agree? So let's start with the decision. So all of you have participated in being an entrepreneur and working with entrepreneurs for many, many years. You have a great set of experience. And so let me start, Jim, with you. What is the trait? What are some of the traits of a successful entrepreneur? What's in the DNA of someone who does this well?
Well, I think you have to be a little psychotic. And starting a company is an experience that isn't meant for everybody. I think a successful entrepreneur is somebody who knows himself really, really well, who talks to other people, is very communicative, and can recognize good science when it slaps him in the face. Making decisions that are logical, sometimes not positive, but being an overall realist, being a people person, being a person who wants to get out there in front of people, an evangelist who can be 100% positive all the time and get slapped in the face 90% of the time. Humility, somebody who can attract the right people to the company and then manage and reward the people in the company in ways that make them move forward. Somebody who can identify investors and understand where they're coming from and how they like to work together and how you want them to work together with you. So it's not just any investor, it's really looking around and finding a group of maybe 50 VCs that have reputations of working well together with once they're syndicated.
Jim, let me move to Sharon. What are the traits that you've seen in people who've been successful? You've been a successful CEO, you've started companies. What is it to you? How do you boil it down? What is the heart of this?
Can you hear me? Yes. I think you have to be self-motivating. You have to be completely motivated to move forward. And not only you need to motivate yourself, you need to motivate others. So you have to be able to get others excited around your idea of what you want to do and be able to lead them towards sort of the next milestone. There's a lot of uncertainty in any startup. So you have to be able to deal with uncertainty and be able to move forward in those uncertain times. That's very, very important. It's never clear what's going to happen around the next corner. Early stage companies, startups, is all about ups and downs. So you have to be able to perform on the down times as well as the up times. So that's very critical. So I think that's one of the things that I've seen that's really critical.
Walter, what is your experience when people present to you their vision, their idea? What is it about people that stand out that make them successful?
So you talked about telling real stories, but I want to actually tell a fable for a second because I think it absolutely epitomizes entrepreneuring. It's about some hungry soldiers that go into a village. They're very hungry. They don't have anything to eat, of course. So like an entrepreneur, they're hungry, and basically they have an idea, which is they like to eat, but they don't really have any resources at all. And all the shutters slam shut as they come into the village. Nobody wants to give them anything. Finally, the one person who's a little bit sympathetic says, here's a pot. Go make yourself some soup. So they take the pot, they go to the river, they fill it up with water, and they start a fire, and they start boiling it. And they say, we're going to make stone soup. People start opening up the shutters a little bit just to see what these guys are. They're putting stones in stone soup. How does that taste? Well, stone soup's actually really good and very nutritious. It's actually better if you put a few carrots into it. And finally, someone who's looking out their shutter comes, here, I'll give you a couple carrots. And they put a few carrots in and say, wow, stone soup's starting to smell pretty good. Well, it's actually a little better if you put some celery into it too and some onions. And a few people come and put a few, the people are getting interested in what they're doing. And eventually, of course, somebody puts some meat into it and the whole town feasts on this pot of delicious soup. And I think so these guys start out hungry. They start out with nothing. They find somebody who's going to give them the like minimum necessary to get to the point where they can get the next thing that they need to get enough people interested so that the first contribution, the second contribution, and by the time they're done, piece by piece by piece, they've got a real pot of soup and they can feed themselves and everybody else. So I think that the combination of hunger, imagination, the ability to understand why those shutters are closed and what it might take to open them, and get people to start contributing and make the most out of out of the resources that you don't actually control. Those are the skills that entrepreneurs have, and of course, an enormous amount of energy to get all that done and to have all those conversations with all those refractory people.
Walter, you're talking about a lot of leadership and drive and commitment. In order for people to contribute to what you just described in the context of this soup, what is something that could be a fatal flaw? What could be something that would turn people away and make them not successful in this endeavor? Jim, what's something that absolutely can be a problem for emerging entrepreneurs?
Anything.
Could you be a little more specific?
You know, I think not being able to go out and be really an extroverted person and building excitement in the community about what you're doing, about what the company is about, what the science is about, and always, always, always evangelizing. And from the elevator to a meeting like this, anytime you have an opportunity to talk.
Sometimes evangelists can be zealots, and sometimes it turns people off if someone's a passionate scientist and he or she has an idea, but they kind of go overboard with a lot of hyperbole, a lot of excess. Shahram, when you meet people like that, how do you react to that?
Well, just to build on that point, I think a lack of humbleness really turns people off. When you go out and present and talk to people, as an entrepreneur, you always are learning. And there's always things that you don't know that you're being presented to. To be open to hear ideas and build upon them, I think is really important. When we hear an entrepreneur who thinks that he or she knows absolutely everything about everything, you know, that's a bit of a turnoff because let's face it, from the time you start a venture till you're halfway through it or more, I would say more than 50% of the plan has already changed. Why has it changed? Because you've learned new things, because you had to adopt to new tactics to the market, to the customers. So being able to be open to absorb and react and rebuild your plan and move forward is really important. Those who are humble, who can learn that and who can adopt are successful. Those who sort of stick on their path probably are not. So I think that's really important.
Thank you. So let's move a little further. The decision has been made. In that context, Walter, when you see people come and present for the first time possibly, describe the background that they might have with regards to data, intellectual property. What are the minimums? What do some entrepreneurs fail to realize is essential to have buttoned up at the very outset?
Well, I guess there are two different kinds of answers to that. One is, so in the actual presentation itself, I think the number one thing people don't realize is, you know, if you're an English speaker and you're going in to pitch some Italian-speaking people, you're going to speak Italian. You're not, you know, if you can. Or else you're going to make sure that there's a translator there. And I think the number one problem is people go in, let's say that, you know, typically we're working with scientists who are very steeped in their domain expertise, and they don't necessarily speak investor, or they're just learning to speak investor, meaning not just the language, not, you know, knowing, you know, terms like, you know, return on investment and things like that, but also understanding what the interests that underlie those terms and what it is that people actually need to know about to understand what the deal is. So to be able to translate from science to investment, for example. So I think that's the number one thing and that's the number one thing that goes wrong in presentations also, is the failure to make because other than that, nobody knows everything. Nobody has the entire range of domain expertise, so they need to know what they don't know and have those other people in the room.
Jim, say a little bit about the tools that an entrepreneur needs to build out early, whether it's a business plan or a private placement memorandum. Obviously, it will depend upon the stage of funding and the target audience, but what are the kinds of tools that are absolutely critical to have as part of the presentation?
Well, I think there are two presentations that you have to put together. One is an investor presentation, and the other is a partnering presentation. The investor presentation is the more important, since that comes first. And in an investor presentation, nobody's going to invest in your company if you don't have solid intellectual property. So that has to be in there. a management team should be in there, and an idea, an overview of the science that will get an investor interested and give an investor views towards their possible exits and how they can make money for their limited partners and themselves. So that's one side. The science presentation, the partnering presentation, is much more heavy on data, but really top-line data, and needs to interest a pharma company or another partner in possibly investing money in you and collaborating on a project. So I don't think a company can go anywhere unless there's intellectual property. And without that, it's a science project, and that's what you don't want.
Thank you. I'd like to shift a little bit to the management team. You brought up the management team. So for an early company that isn't funded, there may be a virtual or pseudo-management team, a group of people that are willing to join once funded, or already participating sort of with sweat equity or on the side or this kind of thing. Describe a little bit your experience of the type of management team, the types of people and roles that need to be in place really at the startup level. Sharon, would you share?
Thank you. So things have changed in the past, say, 15 years. You know, when I started my first company 15 years ago, it was about, you know, getting together a management team, building a company, raising a few $1 million, you know, developing a product or a prototype, and then showing that, and then raise another level of money. So it's about, you know, building all that. I think things have changed post 2008. When I started my second company post 2008, it was about project management. It's about moving the ball one step forward and de-risking it. So there, it's much more focused on the project than people. So virtual companies grew, you know, probably about half of the companies that we invest now are sort of virtual. So you definitely do need, you know, a champion who can manage that project, but do you need a CFO? No. Do you need a, you know, business development person? No, right away, not necessarily. You need a person that managed that project to the next level. So you have to be very flexible of what and who do you need in that process to move the ball forward. So it's not about building companies anymore, it's about moving project one step forward, and all the resources that you need should be aligned with that goal.
Thank you. Jim, Walter, anything to add?
Well, all the companies that I'm working with now have, they're all around 20 people, large, 19 are scientists and 1 is business. The one business guy is the CEO, and he does it all, including the finance. And the scientists do their job and follow a business plan and R&D plan to do exactly what you said, get to the next step. It's adding value, adding value, adding value, adding value, and trying as best you can not to go backwards. So I would say early stage companies are all about science, and with a CEO that's all about business.
Sure.
You know, Jim brings in a lot of good points right around science-focused companies. But just to add to that, you know, we invest also in companies that are in health IT that are not based on core and science. I think to take that one step back and make it more general, you need to do something to keep others out. So you have to have a competitive advantage. In what Jim's saying perspective is science. That's what keeps people out. That's built IP. If it's not science, if it's health IT, for example, it's about fast execution into the market. It's about keeping others out of that market segment. And whatever resources that you have, in this case scientists, in the other case, maybe salespeople. You need to have salespeople to go out and sell and capture that market share, sell your product, get that adoption. So I think it's very important to have people who focus again on what you need to accomplish. In a technology-based company, science-based, you know, biopharma, you know, science is probably the right thing, exactly as what Jim says. In a non-science company, it's maybe other people. So you've got to be very focusing on, if you need to have a partnership, maybe it's a business development person to get your next deal. So I think that's really key.
Sharm, you mentioned pre and post 2008. So it's 2014. Walter, how would you describe the economic environment today for life sciences? And can all of you think a little bit about, when you answer this question, talking about the Mid-Atlantic region? That's our area of focus, of course. And could you talk a little bit about where we are, how you see 2014 and beyond?
Yeah, I guess the thing that's been most stunning, I'm not sure exactly the dates of the shift, but if you look at a chart over time of how much of life science, total life science investment that gets made, which is, you know, in the ballpark of 12 to 14 billion dollars in a year goes into early stage life science things. And to me, it was sort of shocking to see how much of that actually comes from angel investors, given that those investments on average are maybe 15% the size of a VC investment. So VCs in general, not you know, this is a gross generalization, but have moved later stage, and the gap to, you know, there's still a gap, the famous, you know, valley of death of funding where out there, but to the extent that it's filled, it's been really, angel investors are investing as much in total dollars as VCs. So increasingly to take the approach that Sharon was talking about, where you're building a project and you're seeing what you need along the way, not only are you going to have different people, but you're going to have different investors along the way. And the early investors increasingly over time have become first, you know, friends and family who are basically investing in the individual. They don't necessarily get caught up in the idea as much. And then angel investors who don't necessarily know the investor, although the entrepreneur, but of course need to believe in the team, but also the idea. And those people provide that next piece of funding. And that's really different than it was in 2002, earlier times when there were a lot of life science VCs that were focused early stage. So that's I think that's the fundamental one, and an increasing need to go to partnering, as Jim said, early on, to talk to those folks about what kinds of funding they have sometimes for early stage things, depending on exactly what domain it's in.
Right. Thanks, Walter. Jim?
So I'm a planner, so in a business plan, you need a finance plan. And that's from day one all the way through to an exit and how you're going to achieve the exit. But on day one, personally, this is my view, is when at Smart Biosciences, where I never took a salary. You know, why should I take a salary and pay taxes on the salary when that money could go to furthering the science in the company? So that was my contribution to the company. We spent a lot of time looking for NIH money through small business awards, SBIRs and STTRs, and we got those. And I have friends in the region that have financed the entire company through that mechanism, and that's great when that happens, because you know SBIRs are awarded the same way as NIH grants are. They're study sections, they're reviewed, and they're prioritized, and the money's given out. Initially for the first grant, it's maybe a couple $100,000, but phase 2 grants are big and can be over $1.5 million to $2 million, which is great if you can get 2 or 3 of those, which companies can do. So you have that, you're validated by a peer group on the study section that awarded them, and then you can go to the next stage. And angel money is, well, to me, it was always a little frustrating to get that. And the step after that are the seed venture guys like BioAdvance, and they are wonderful. You know, this is a commercial for BioAdvance, let me tell you. We were in the Science Center, BioAdvance was the next floor up, and they were the best consultants for me to help understand finance, which I didn't do, I didn't have any understanding of, and how to plan. And so BioAdvance and 2 other seed funds came together to fund a science plan for us. And BioAdvance was the first tranche. And those guys, I tell you, Barbara and the team are great. Then after the seed money, you have a a validated R&D plan, then you can go to the venture funds, the big ones for the bigger money. So one of the things that BioAdvance asks for when you apply is that you have soft circle to Series A. So there's somebody out there that's willing to syndicate a Series A. That helps them invest because that's their exit. So we did that, and the good news was that we put together a syndicate that was led by MPM for $25 million on delivering the R&D plan. So that was over about 1.5 years.
Sharm, you're smiling, so
Shall
how do
I
you
say
respond to
anymore?
that great compliment about your
No.
company?
No, I'm just smiling at the compliment. But
Yeah.
Thank you, Jim. If the question is what has changed, 3 things. 15 years ago, none of my investors wanted companies, and I think that's true for most of all the startups, to have any kind of grants. Getting grants, getting angel money was out. 5 years ago, grants were in. Every one of our companies were applying for grants, and I think today is a little bit the same. So getting non-dilutive capital from a whole source of not just NIH and NSF, but a whole source of granting agencies is really important. Probably about half of our companies do that now, right? What has changed, and I'll just go back to what Walter says, that what's really changed today is angel capital, because all the VCs move later stage, and I would say majority of our companies have an angel investor in there, and that's what you need, that first few $100,000, and that's helpful. Sometimes that comes before our money, sometimes it comes with our money, or sometimes after, but that is the most significant change in the market.
Gentlemen, can you talk a little bit about within the Mid-Atlantic region, if you're seeing some trends, whether it's in the DC, Maryland area, Philadelphia, Princeton, New York, in terms of the focus on life sciences?
Well, I guess the bad news for the greater Philadelphia area is Boston. And all the pharma companies putting significant efforts in Boston and taking it away from this region. The future, I think, for Philadelphia, the science is great, and the academic institutions are good. One of the problems is the funding is in where the money is. Philadelphia right now doesn't have so much venture capital. And the good news is that I can't tell you the name of the firm, but a rather prominent venture fund is going to open an office in Philadelphia in the next probably few months. This is a big fund. So they hopefully will bring others to the table. And when that happens, I think the Philadelphia will start to develop more companies that are local and that are here. The Science Center is a good place to be, but again, they don't fund companies, and they provide space and homes, but they don't provide any money. At least right now, they don't.
Walter.
Yeah, I think that like so much else in our world, even the early stage capital markets globalizing, and when we raise money, a lot of times it's coming from China, from other places as well, and people are increasingly, I'm sure, many of you are spending time talking to on Skype and other ways, people in a lot of places that you probably wouldn't have been doing business with quite so readily 5 or 10 years ago, and I think that it's important to have local, especially at the early stage, some local supporters, and I still hear investors who say I only invest in companies that I can get to the board meeting on a bicycle on, but that's rarer than it used to be. That used to be a lot of people's real criteria for one of their check marks for early stage investing. I don't think that's true anymore. I think it's getting less true, and it's less feasible and to get it done that way. I mean, so that the regional part of it is what this institution and others are doing, which is to provide a location, but the capital is going to come from a lot of different places.
Sure.
Absolutely right, but let me bring another point up about the region. What's really unique about this region, it's about talent, and that's what really counts, right? Early stage companies are about people. So what has happened in the past 5 years is that all these pharma companies have shut off all these, good people. So these guys are out there, these folks, and they are our best people sometimes to start companies because they have done it before, they know what is missing in the market sometimes, they have some experience, and they're not desperate for money either. Sometimes they have severances, sometimes. So those people are the folks that we see the best in terms of presenting. So that's really, really valuable. That's number one. So having human capital in this region is very unique. I would say in some ways, in certain areas, like biotech is even more unique than Boston and San Francisco, just highlighting some of the positive, because we already know, where Boston and San Francisco is ahead of us in some ways. The other area that I think is unique over Boston and San Francisco here is health IT. You have some payers, you have IBX, you have Aetna, you have these insurance companies that are now being regulated and are under pressure, and they're local, a lot of them. It's headquartered local. So I think that in health IT, we'll see some advantage in this region over some other areas.
Thank you all. So we're now moving into the third part of this 5-part panel 1. And I have a couple of questions that I didn't tell the panelists about before that we didn't discuss. So in the spirit of getting to know them, just as we want to get to know you, you have 5 seconds. What's your favorite food? Walter?
Peking duck.
Peking duck. Jim?
Oh, boy. Hot fudge sundae.
Sounds pretty good. Shahram, you had more time to think about it?
I was going to say salmon, but I got to say half our Sunday could beat it.
All right, we're going to go the other direction. In the last year, what's the longest period of time you can remember not being connected to Wi-Fi, the internet, or cell phone?
Probably 2 days.
2 days. That long. Jim?
14 hours to Japan.
On the flight.
Yeah, about the same.
I know you were in India recently. Did
Right,
you have?
There was no Wi-Fi on the plane. That was it.
All right, so we're going into the money, okay? We've started talking about sources of money. We're going to go a little bit deeper. And I'd like to bring up the term valuation. So people come early, they have a cocktail napkin type of idea of a valuation. Tell us a little bit from your perspective on the ranges that you've seen, on the quality of that valuation, when it's properly risk adjusted, et cetera. Talk a little bit about valuation for the audience. Shahram, would you like to start?
Sure. So we typically invest in a convertible debt. So we leave the valuation for the next large investor. Having said that, we do have some terms in our investment that talks about what we call optional conversion, which comes to valuation. So in terms of valuation, early stage, it is really difficult to say. I mean, in biotech, what you see, if the idea or the project is fundable, at least to put a seed capital into it, is somewhere between $2 to $4 million. That's sort of where it is. I mean, it's very arbitrary in many ways. It's very tough to try to value an early stage pre-capital, sometimes preclinical company, but that's sort of a range. So this is in sort of general life sciences, tool space, maybe devices, and biotech. If you get into health IT, things a little bit are different. Because that's really a different sector, and there it's a broader range, so maybe 1 to 5. So that's what we have. With respect to the tools, it's really tough. There's not that many tools. There's comparables you can put. I would say a discounted cash flow is pretty much out. I mean, almost for life sciences, it's out the window unless you have revenue coming in, you have contract, and you can do some discounted cash flow. Otherwise, the classical valuation methods are pretty much out.
Yes, agree.
Jim agrees. Walter,
Yeah.
do you agree?
Not really. I mean, I definitely agree about convertible notes. I mean, and I'll tell you why. You can do a valuation. I mean, you can, and it's not. It's really a scenario analysis, right? You can be very simple when you're saying is it $2 to $4 million or whatever. What that is really, it is the analysis of, let's say there are three outcomes. You know, there's the goes bust, it hits the jackpot, or it's somewhere in the middle. And you could probably put a number on each of those things and how long it would take. And then comes the key part where the entrepreneurs and the investors don't see the same. You've got to put a probability to each of those three scenarios. So if you know the top one has, let's say, a present value of $100 million, and the bottom one, of course, is 0, and the middle one is 30. Now you get down, so you know, it's some blend of 130 and 0. Now the question is, what's the probability of each of those things? And if you could do that right, if you get people to agree, you could probably agree on, there might be a reason why 2 to 4 was the number that you ended up coming up with, you know. But because you can't get the entrepreneur, who, as Jim told us at the very beginning, has got to be hopelessly optimistic in the face of real odds.
necessarily.
Well, but has to assign if they didn't assign a high probability to the upside scenario, they would give up long before they do. So, but anyway, I agree that you use convertible notes in order to just finesse that whole thing until it becomes clear what the real scenarios look like and what the real probabilities of success for them are.
Well, I can tell you how SMART got valued. And we were all in Baltimore sitting around a table. There were 3 funds and me, and we're talking about valuation. This is a company that had fantastic, really interesting technology and IP in the Alzheimer's space, but no product, no structure. So we were talking about how much that was worth. So I said, well, how about, I handed everybody a napkin and I said, write down a number, and we'll talk about those numbers. So we all wrote down a number, and we all wrote down the same number.
Wow.
And it was $1.5 million. And everybody felt comfortable. There was no negotiation, and that really set the basis for the rest of the discussion.
Well, that I think that's a surprising story. I think when it really gets down to actually getting past the convertible note to what's at the next round, when valuation gets set, it really only gets set one way, and that's by having a competitive, unless there's some competition for the deal, which is really part of what that CEO that is the only business person in the group that you mentioned is trying to do, is create a competition so that you really do find out what the market price is, because that's the valuation, right, is what somebody will give you.
That's right. I know this is jumping to Ryan's panel around exits, but can you imagine WhatsApp being worth $17 billion to Facebook? I mean, I guess it's what someone's willing to pay, right? So we're going to start with the Q&A in about 5 minutes. We have a couple more things to cover. Is that okay? So let's talk a little bit about the pitch. You've made the decision to start your company. You've put the tools together. You have an idea of what you'd like to present. When people pitch to you, what have you seen go well? What's the quality of a presentation, the structure of the delivery that is compelling to potential investors?
So the very, very best pitch that I ever saw was a pitch that was maybe the 3rd time that this investor and I had been at the same VC, except the difference was that each time he had under-promised and over-delivered. So by the time we were back there, 9 months, 12 months later, the actual results exceeded the projection that they'd shown. And that was the deal. The deal was done. And I don't really remember what the presentation was. The point was that having underperformed, the company's now a $2.8 billion company on the New York Stock Exchange. At the time, it was a company with $1.5 million of revenues. So this was unlike the kinds of companies that Jim's been focusing on that are IP based. This is a company that's doing medicinal. WuXi Pharmatech, they do medicinal chemistry. It's a service. They don't have a lot of IP around it. And they get revenues. The worst presentation that I think I ever saw was one that was a fantastically crafted PowerPoint presentation, perfectly laid out, and the entrepreneur was so rigidly adherent to his script and his PowerPoint slides that he didn't hear what the investor was actually asking, and couldn't skip to slide 14 and answer it and get that, like that nagging question that's like in front of the investor's face like a huge wall. And until you move it aside, they're not going to hear. In other words, it didn't matter how good the material was because there just wasn't a dialogue going on.
Yeah, I'm going to share a small story on a project that I'm working on now, and I'd love your thoughts on this. So we're trying to raise $5.5 million for an emerging company. And there's a company interested in investing about $1 to $1.5 million, but they don't want to be the lead investor. And the CEO of the company keeps saying, well, if you invest that, you can be the lead investor, or that's all we'll take. And they keep sort of changing their goal or their strategy. Shahram, tell us a little bit about how important it is that when someone's requesting money, that they stay true to their game plan, as opposed to adapting to what they hear, or maybe not listening what the potential investor is saying.
Sure. I'll answer that in the context of the first question, probably. So you know, what we see as good pitches are things that address 3 or 4 points. Let's put it this way. One is what problem you're solving. And by the way, the problem is not how big the market is. So if you come to us and say how big the cancer market is, we sort of roll our eye. Everyone knows that, right? So the problem you're solving, how you're solving it, and what's the first milestone to that solution is, what does it take to solve it, and who's going to do it. These are 4, simple as that. You know,
Very clear.
Very clear, right? So if you so to answer your second question, you have to stay true to the plan, to the first milestone. You have to stay true to the problem you're solving and what's your first milestone. And how you're going to do it, the amount of funding that's needed, who's going to do it. You can't change that. Once you change that, our bets are off, right? But it's very simple. You don't have to have a lot of projections, how you're going to exit. I mean, those things will fall in place. But what we would focus on is those 4 things, very clear.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. We said that we'd talk a little bit about crowdfunding. So would one of you like to give your observations on the state of affairs when it comes to crowdsourcing or crowdfunding?
Well, Kickstarter just passed $1 billion.
Right. What about for life sciences? Is there a role for crowdfunding in life sciences, Walter?
Well, so we talked a little bit about angel investors, and you know, when I go out with companies to angel investors, I mean, for a life science company, that's all we do. It's got to be life science angels. It's got to be people who already have either they are pharmaceutical executives, they are retired VCs, or they are people who are medical people. They've got to have some domain expertise, because otherwise they're either smart investors and they realize at a certain point in their due diligence that they don't understand what they don't understand and they give up, or they're dumb investors, in which case you just don't want them, because it's gonna come back and bite somehow or other. Given how long the time frames are in life sciences, you need to have people who understand it. I think it's extremely ill-suited to crowdsourcing for that reason. The idea of people investing because they think it's a cool idea without having any recognition of the timelines involved. It's just so I will wait. I'm sure there's gonna be some of it, but I think there's gonna be a lot of litigation early on, and the SEC is still kind of deciding how this is gonna work.
So that brings us to the last area for panel 1. Everything has gone well, let's say the pitch, the presentation, the story, and now the money is going to be delivered, the check is going to be written. Are there sometimes last-minute delays or problems that you've seen? Everything is going very well, and then at the 11th hour, something goes wrong. We'll just take a moment or two on this question, please.
Well, that happened once, not to me, but to a company that was pitching SmithKline, where a $15 million deal at 5 minutes to midnight was torpedoed because a scientist in R&D couldn't confirm some key data, and picked up the phone at about 8 o'clock at night and called George Post. That was a little bit of a nuclear explosion, and it got it got killed. Right then, it was off. And I think, you know, the lesson was that if you're looking for money, that you're absolutely sure and confident in the data that you're presenting, and that it can get reproduced, that it's been reproduced, it'll get reproduced in the future, and you just don't want any surprises. Most of the time, I think financings go pretty smoothly. If you can find a lead investor, that will do it.
You know, Jack Welch in his first book after he left GE said, you can give me good news or you can give me bad news, but don't give me surprises. And I think
Right.
that's one thing we want to minimize is surprises. So let's say the investment effort has been successful. The capital has been raised. This isn't the end of the story, gentlemen. This is sort of the beginning in many ways. Let's finish up and then we'll lead into the second panel with your thoughts on the relationship going forward between the investor and the company, the new level of governance, the new kinds of interactions that will occur for this startup company. Walter.
Well, I mean, it's sort of a fiction. You know, this panel's at the beginning as if you raise the money and then you're done with that and you move into running the company. And we all know that raising money is something that goes on for life sciences, goes on for years and years over the course of the thing. So get a lot of the, I mean, as Jim said, if you haven't planned without knowing every contingency that's going to come up, plan a sequence of financings with the idea that you've structured the early ones so that the early investors are going to be with you, not against you, when you have to do the later ones. So at least think about that structure. That's the whole purpose of a convertible note structure, actually, is to make it so that it's easy to make to bring these early investors into the next round, to think about how these things phase, so you've got a coherent structure that you can move forward with while you start running the company, because you're not done. You're going to be doing it if you've got a typical life science project. You're going to need millions more than however much you've raised. You're still going to need millions more.
And that's what we're going to discuss today, this sort of ongoing process. Shahram, any thoughts on the governance? Talk about board seats or things that maybe a small company wasn't used to before getting funded. A little bit about that relationship.
Well, you know, I think what's probably more important is that once you've closed the investment, I think you are a partner in the same project. So it's partner in good times, partner in bad times, and it's like everything else. It's good communication, it's complete transparency. So when it comes to board relationship or investor relationship, I think transparency is what's really important. Governance, to a lesser extent, you would hope that the board and the investors are aligned so that governance issues do not come up in that sense as a large company. And I think the way to make sure that happens is no surprises, like you said, transparency and good communication. The board, I mean, you're interacting with the company much more than, you know, once a quarter or once every 2 months. You're interacting with the company on a weekly basis. So.
Well, I'd like to thank you all for such a candid discussion with very practical sets of advices and guidance from your experience for our audience. And at this time, we're going to turn it over for questions. I feel you may not hear me as well. There is a microphone right in the middle of the room. Although the room isn't particularly large, but if you'd like to go to the microphone or from your seat, raise your hand. We would love to have some questions, please.
Dr. Foley, you said there was the investor presentation, what was required in that, and you said a partnering presentation, and you said top-line data. What did you mean by top-line data? Is that scientific data, financial data, sales data?
Yeah, scientific data. I mean, you know, in partnering presentations, you get from 15 minutes to 50 minutes. And you just use the time, you know, to deliver information to a group of people that will keep them interested in what you're doing.
Thank you. There's a question from Dr. Daly.
I wanted to throw this off to the panel. Right now, I understand there's lots of opportunities. We have talent, Boston has talent, San Francisco has talent. Okay? There's exciting maybe growth opportunities here. Something may be coming. But if we're starting emerging life science company that's going to seek money, and now looking at our next level, if you're an investor in that company, you tell them, go west, young man.
No. Well, you know, at SMART, we pitched angel groups as far away as San Francisco, California Angels. And that was very, very smart money. You know, to Walter's point, you don't want to take dumb money. You want investors that have a Rolodex that can pick up the phone and make calls for you, introduce you to people that you need to know. And then understand what the business is, understand the risks, and understand the contingencies that you can follow. And if you don't have that, if you have a dumb board and it's all on you, that's not a recipe for success. So it's smart. We put together a board that were all industry people. So there was investment in it, there was preclinical discovery, and then there was somebody who had a broad management experience in big pharma.
Any other comments to Mike's question?
I just really, I think that that people are regional, capital is not so regional. And I would leave the people, if there's a group of people that are in the right place, bring the capital to them, not the other way around, by and large. That's sometimes for a very early stage, I would make an exception, but not later on.
Thank you. We have a question right here, please.
I wonder if any of the panelists could address the trade-off between value and potential limiting or liabilities, if you will, of getting an early licensing deal done for your technology. Say you have a lead product, a platform that could engender follow-on products, license out the lead product early on, even pre-financing. You know, I'll talk from pharma. There is no such thing as an early licensing deal anymore. Maybe on a platform technology or on a preclinical compound that cures cancer in virtually every animal model it's put into. But most of the time, and especially in oncology, a partnering deal is based on phase 2B proof of concept. So you show it works in about 300 patients. And you know, safety, that's a gross safety, but it has to work and it has to be robust. There has to be a dose response, and it has to, I think products now have to meet some sort of unmet need to get pharma company interest.
Yeah, we've seen earlier ones, even sometimes preclinical, but I would say I agree that there's nothing that's too early. So I would definitely go with the licensing deal over anything else.
But having said that, it's really great to go out and visit pharma companies with your science maybe once a year, keep them up to date, you know, and develop a little bit of a network and potential champions in the company.
Yeah. So I'm going to disagree here with the panelists and say, so we raised $4.6 million in early 2013 for a company that had a preclinical product for an orphan indication. And they didn't have animal efficacy data yet. And as a matter of fact, we discussed it with Biovance. But in the intervening period, at the end of this story is going to be that in November of 2013, it was bought, the company, in the context of licensing discussions, was bought for $15 million upfront and $130 million of milestone payments down the road. So I think, but the question is about, and it got licensed in a deal that relied on some data coming through and being replicated, and it happened the day after that deal was replicated, it got sold. But that was in the context of having conversations with all the major players in that field for the entire period of time, from the time we raised the money. By the time it was sold in November, we were already having quite vigorous discussions with investors in the next financing series, because they wanted to hear the question, what are you hearing from the possible exit partners? It's tremendous ammunition with the next round of investors. That's what they want to know. What's the exit? What does it look like? What have you heard? What are the proof points? What boxes need to be checked? Is it what Jim said? You got to have phase 2A or phase 2B. You know, where do you need to be for this to happen? So you get the information and the expertise from those partners and what they have to tell you. You get a story to tell the next, that's absolutely true, not your guess about what the exit partners are saying, but what they're really saying. And potentially you actually make the deal, and or at least have a choice at the point when you get to that financing point of either going the route of making that deal that you're talking about, or alternatively saying, we're not going to take that deal now, we're going to take the $10 million behind door number 2, but we wouldn't have gotten there. You know, you only get to the point where someone's going to be willing to do that when they realize that you are going to eventually have these options again, because that's, you know, a near miss suggests that there's going to be a hit later. So I think it's really important to do that. And when we work with clients, we try to get to partnering, the strategic partnering discussions happening immediately, all the way through, in parallel with the discussions with angels, with the subsequent discussions with VCs, that it's all part of one process.
You know, to your point, the deal flow in a pharma company like Bristol Myers Squibb is on the order of 2,500 to 3,000 opportunities a year. So that will get knocked down, you know, to maybe 200 confidentiality agreements. That gets knocked down to 75 companies coming in to present. And that gets knocked down to 3 significant deals a year. And venture funds sometimes are just as bad. They have, Quaker has 700 a year, 700 business plans a year, and they fund about 2 or 3. So to your point, getting out and getting into companies and talking about your science, not asking for a partnership, but simply talking about the science, how it fits with the company, how it can help the company meet its strategic goals early on, and eventually you'll get to a point where you'll have the data that it takes to partner, and then I think a deal, at least on the scientific side, on the R&D side, will go very quickly.
A question here.
Yeah, question. Have you ever seen a really good idea, but you didn't really feel that I guess the management team of the company was going to be able to bring it to fruition? In those cases,
Question has to do with a really good idea, but not a strong management team. How have you advised those companies with regards to getting the right advisors to be successful? Really good question. Thank you.
Every week. We
Yeah.
probably see one every week. The answer is yes. So, and we do what you just mentioned. We ask them to surround themselves with good advisors and or get, you know, a partner. Titles are sort of meaningless at this point, at this early stage. Who's a CEO, who's a president, who's a CEO is sort of meaningless. You need a partner to have the right skills, get a partner to have the right skills and work with you. And if that person is open to those kind of partnership, those are the skills that you want. You want people who are collaborative, right? So I think that also checks a box for us.
Well, thank you very much for the Q&A. We're going to allow our panelists to have about a minute to wrap up with some of their sort of take-home messages from the discussion, from the questions, and we'll start with Walter with sort of closing comments.
So I guess what you probably heard today and what I talked to people looking for funding for companies about is a metaphor of building a bridge across a big wide river. And you can't really, and at one end is you with your idea, and at the other side of the river is, you know, success and investors pay off and founders getting what they're looking for and so forth. And it's just simply too wide to build all in one span. You're going to have to break it up into workable pieces, and each pier is going to have to be one little span of the bridge that gets you partway across. You're going to have to convince the investors who are going to build that pier and that span of the bridge with you that they understand what the next pier of the bridge is and what it's, you know, why it's going to be an up round, why the people who look at what you've built, this little, you know, little quarter of a bridge across this wide river, when people coming afterwards look at it, why they're going to see enough there to say it's worth building the next piece. It's a big risk that they're taking. And having that idea of breaking, and this boils down to a Gantt chart, a project plan with dollar figures attached to each piece. That's the bridge, that you can explain to investors what the payoff is, what their bet is, going from this point to this point, what the investor's betting on so that they know it if they see it happening. Sure, no matter how much you manage expectations, there are going to be some surprises, but at least people at the beginning know what it is that they're betting on, what has to go right for the next people to come in and get, because you're never going to get off across the river in one big swoop. And that's a mistake people, I think, often make, is not realizing how it's got to be broken down into these project pieces that have been described several times today.
Well, Walter, you started with a beautiful analogy talking about making stone soup, and you've ended with a beautiful story about making a bridge. I think those visuals are really very helpful, and I appreciate that. So thank you, Walter. Jim?
Well, a business plan that is in reasonable detail, that's flexible, realizing that the odds of you ending up where you think you're going to end up in 5 years are against you. You'll probably be in a different place. I from big pharma and strategic planning, I like thinking of business plans in a sort of a 10-3-1, 10-year vision, 3-year goal, and at 1 year what you have to do and where you have to be to get to that 3 years, and where you have to be at 3 years to get to that 5 years, and where you have to be at 5 years to get to what exit you're going to get. Because there's no way that you're ever going to develop your own product. It's going to be licensed or you're going to be bought. There's just not enough money for a small company, unless there's, you see every once in a while $130 million financing. Unless you get one of those, it's going to be in collaboration with somebody. But getting to that collaboration is a path, a map, that is going to be like GPS. There'll be 5 different routes you can get there. And you have to be flexible enough to take any one of those 5 and appreciate up front what they might be.
Thank you, Jim. Sharon, closing comments.
I've always said you have to work with end in mind. You have to know where you're going to get before you even start. If I bring an analogy, it's like, climbing a mountain. If you know where the peak is, at any point you can figure out if you're going against it, around it, or toward it. If you're starting a startup company, you have to figure out what the end game is, and then build specific milestones, and then work a plan toward those. Let me bring an example. If it's a biotech company, you think the end is a phase 2A data, then it's about validating the technology on the preclinical. That's the milestone. Build a plan toward that. If it's a diagnostic device, it's about market adoption. That's when you're going to get acquired. That has to do with your indication. Build a plan, a clinical trial, and a test to prove your indication to get to the adoption. If it's a health IT, it's about getting to $5 million, $10 million. What does it take to get there, right? So build a plan backward. Start from the end, build a plan backward, and be very focused on specific milestones.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank our panelists.